The surgical floor was unusually quiet that night. Monitors beeped softly. Nurses moved between rooms. Surgeons prepared for an overnight emergency procedure. Near the end of the hallway, ward nurse Daniel Hayes adjusted an 4-line for an elderly patient. He spoke little. Most staff barely noticed him. Then the elevators stopped. Every light on the floor flickered once. A second later, masked men carrying rifles stepped into the corridor and locked every exit. Panic spread instantly. Doctors froze. Patients screamed. Security officers disappeared from their radios. Within minutes, the entire surgical floor was under armed control. The gunmen believed they had trapped a building full of helpless civilians. They looked at Daniel Hayes and saw only another nurse. What they didn't realize was that the quiet man standing beside the medication cart had spent years operating in places where panic meant death. And before the night was over, everyone on that floor would discover who Daniel Hayes really was. St. Gabriel Medical Center never truly slept. Even after midnight, lights remained on behind nurses' stations, monitors continued their endless rhythm of beeps, and tired staff moved through the corridors carrying charts, medications, and coffee cups. The surgical floor occupied the 7th level of the hospital. Most of its patients were recovering from major procedures. Some had undergone heart surgery. Others were recovering from trauma operations after car accidents or workplace injuries. The atmosphere was usually calm during the night shift. That calm depended on dozens of people doing hundreds of small tasks correctly. Among them was ward nurse Daniel Hayes. At first glance, Daniel looked completely ordinary. He was 38 years old, slightly taller than average, with short brown hair and a face that revealed little emotion. He never spoke more than necessary. He avoided hospital gossip. He never volunteered personal stories. Many staff members knew him only as the quiet nurse who always worked nights. Some respected him. Others barely noticed him. At 11:47 p.m., Daniel reviewed medication charts at the nurses' station. Across from him, Nurse Jessica Monroe sighed while rubbing her eyes. 3 double shifts this week, she muttered. I think the hospital is trying to kill me. Daniel glanced at her chart. You missed your break. Jessica looked surprised. How did you know that? You usually drink coffee after your break. She looked down at the untouched cup beside her computer. A small smile appeared. That is actually a little creepy. Daniel returned to his paperwork. It is also accurate. Jessica laughed quietly before returning to her work. The brief exchange ended there. Daniel preferred it that way. A few minutes later, a call light illuminated on room 714. An elderly patient named Harold Benson needed assistance. Daniel stood immediately. He never ignored a call light. Inside the room, Mr. Benson appeared uncomfortable. The 72-year-old man had undergone abdominal surgery earlier that day. Sorry to bother you again, Benson said. You are not bothering me. The older man shifted carefully. I cannot get comfortable. Daniel adjusted several pillows, checked the patient's position, and raised part of the hospital bed. Within moments, the discomfort eased. Mr. Benson looked relieved. You always seem to know exactly what needs fixing. Daniel checked the monitor beside the bed. Most problems leave clues. The patient smiled. That sounds like something a detective would say. Daniel simply nodded. After ensuring everything was stable, he left the room. Back in the hallway, 2 young resident doctors hurried past. One of them nearly collided with a supply cart. Daniel caught the cart before it rolled into a patient's doorway. The resident barely noticed. Thanks, he said while continuing down the hall. His colleague looked back. You ever notice that guy? The nurse. Yeah. What about him? I don't know. The resident shrugged. He just seems strange. The conversation disappeared around the corner. Daniel had heard similar comments before. People often interpreted silence as mystery. The truth was simpler. He preferred observation to conversation. At 12:21 a.m., another patient required assistance. Then another. Then another. Hours in hospitals often passed this way. Quietly. Steadily. One task after another. Yet while most staff focused only on their immediate responsibilities, Daniel constantly observed the larger environment. He noticed which security guard seemed distracted, which elevator arrived late, which visitor spent too much time near restricted areas, which maintenance worker appeared unfamiliar. The habit was automatic. Years of practice had made it impossible to switch off. Near 1 o'clock, Jessica approached him again. "You know, people think you're intimidating." Daniel looked up. "Why?" "Because nobody knows anything about you. I work here." "That is literally all anyone knows." Daniel considered that. "It is enough." Jessica laughed. "For you maybe." She leaned against the counter. "So what did you do before nursing?" Most people asked eventually. Daniel's answer never changed. "A few different jobs." Jessica rolled her eyes. "That is not an answer." "It is the only one I have." Before she could continue, a physician called her name from across the station. The conversation ended. Daniel was grateful. Questions about the past often led to places he preferred not to visit. At 1:34 a.m., the surgical floor settled into one of its quietest periods. Most patients slept. Lights were dimmed. The hallways became nearly empty. Daniel walked his routine rounds. Every room, every monitor, every chart. Nothing unusual. Everything normal. At least on the surface. As he reached a window overlooking the hospital parking lot, something caught his attention. A delivery truck sat near a service entrance. That alone was not unusual. Hospitals received deliveries at all hours. But something about it held his focus. The vehicle had been parked in the same position for longer than expected. Its engine remained running. No visible unloading activity. No movement around the cargo area. Daniel watched for several seconds. Then he checked his watch. A small detail. Probably meaningless. Yet he filed it away mentally. Years earlier, someone had taught him a lesson. People survived dangerous situations because they noticed small things before they became large things. Most of the time, those details meant nothing. Sometimes they meant everything. Daniel continued walking. Room 719. Room 720. Room 721. Everything appeared normal. But somewhere deep in his instincts, a quiet sense of concern had begun to form. Not fear. Not certainty. Just awareness. The kind that appeared before a storm. And while the rest of St. Gabriel Medical Center continued through another ordinary night, Daniel Hayes found himself paying closer attention to the details around him. Because experience had taught him something valuable. The most dangerous nights usually began looking exactly like every other night. The surgical floor remained quiet after 2 o'clock in the morning. For most of the staff, the night had settled into its normal rhythm. Patients slept. Monitors hummed. Nurses completed charts beneath soft fluorescent lights. Outside the large windows at the end of the corridor, darkness covered most of the city. Daniel Hayes continued his rounds. To anyone watching, he looked like he always did. Calm. Focused. Ordinary. But his attention had not left the delivery truck parked below. The image remained in the back of his mind. Not because it was obviously suspicious. Because it did not fit. People often ignored small inconsistencies. Daniel never had. At 2:07 a.m., he stopped briefly at the nurse's station and glanced toward a security monitor mounted near the ceiling. Several camera feeds displayed different sections of the hospital. Parking entrances. Service corridors. Emergency access points. Loading areas. One screen flickered for a moment, then returned to normal. Nobody else noticed. Jessica certainly did not. She was busy updating patient records. A resident physician sat nearby reviewing test results. Life inside the hospital continued uninterrupted. Daniel watched the monitor for another few seconds before returning to work. Half an hour later, he entered room 718. A middle-aged patient named Richard Keller was awake. The man had undergone spinal surgery earlier that day. Pain and anxiety made sleep difficult. "You are still awake," Daniel said. Keller forced a tired smile. "I keep thinking about everything that could go wrong." Daniel checked the 4-line. Your surgery was successful. I know. Your recovery is progressing normally. I know that too. Then what worries you? Keller looked toward the ceiling. The things nobody expects. Daniel paused. The answer lingered in the room longer than either man intended. Finally, Daniel adjusted the blanket. Most people spend too much time worrying about things they cannot control. And you don't. Daniel considered the question. I focus on what is in front of me. The patient nodded slowly. For some reason, the response seemed to calm him. By the time Daniel left the room, Keller had finally closed his eyes. Back in the hallway, Daniel noticed something else. A maintenance worker pushed a cart toward a restricted service corridor. The man wore a hospital uniform. Nothing unusual. Yet Daniel had never seen him before. That alone meant very little. Hospitals employed hundreds of people. Still, something felt off. The worker kept his head down. No identification badge was visible. No interaction with nearby staff. Daniel changed direction and approached. Long night? He asked casually. The worker looked up briefly. Always. His answer came too quickly. Almost rehearsed. Daniel's eyes dropped toward the man's uniform. No department patch. No visible employee number. Again, small details. The worker immediately resumed walking. Daniel let him go. Confronting him would accomplish nothing. Not yet. Instead, he memorized the man's face. The way he moved. The way he avoided eye contact. Then he continued his rounds. At 2:51 a.m., a security officer entered the surgical floor. Officer Reynolds worked most overnight shifts. Daniel knew him well. The man normally greeted staff with a joke or friendly comment. Tonight he looked irritated. What happened? Daniel asked. Reynolds frowned. Communications problem. What kind? Radio interference. Daniel remained silent. The officer shrugged. Probably equipment issues. Probably. Yet Reynolds did not sound convinced. Neither was Daniel. The officer continued down the hallway. For the next several minutes, Daniel watched him attempt multiple radio checks. None appeared successful. By itself, the issue meant little. Combined with everything else, it meant more. The parked truck. The unknown maintenance worker. The camera flicker. The radio interference. Individually, they were harmless. Together, they created a pattern. And patterns mattered. At 3:18 a.m., Daniel stepped into a supply room. Inside, he reviewed inventory levels for several medications. The task took only a few minutes. As he prepared to leave, he heard voices in the adjacent service corridor. Two men. Low conversation. Difficult to hear. One phrase reached him clearly. 3:30. Silence followed. Then footsteps moved away. Daniel opened the door. The corridor was empty. No sign of the speakers. No obvious explanation. His eyes scanned both directions. Nothing. For a moment, he stood completely still. Listening. Watching. Thinking. Then he returned to the surgical floor. At the nurse's station, Jessica noticed his expression. You look concerned. I am thinking. About what? Daniel glanced toward the elevators. Probably nothing. Jessica smiled. That sounds reassuring. He did not answer. Because he was no longer certain. At 3:26 a.m., he called hospital security. The supervisor answered after several rings. Daniel explained the unusual truck. The unidentified worker. The communication issues. The supervisor listened patiently. Then sighed. Daniel, we appreciate your attention to detail. That sentence alone told him everything. But none of that sounds like an emergency. No. We'll look into it. Daniel thanked him and ended the call. He knew exactly what would happen next. Nothing. Most warnings were ignored before a crisis. That was human nature. People trusted normalcy. They preferred simple explanations. Hospitals especially depended on routine. Routine made people comfortable. Comfort made people overlook risks. At 3:41 a.m., Daniel walked toward the window again. The truck remained exactly where it had been. Engine running. Lights off. No activity. No movement. No reason. His concern deepened. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like a shadow growing longer. Behind him, the surgical floor continued operating normally. Doctors reviewed charts. Nurses administered medications. Patients slept. Nobody sensed danger. Nobody imagined that within the next hour, their entire world would change. Daniel looked down at the parking lot one final time. Then something happened. The truck's headlights flashed once. A brief signal. Barely noticeable. 3 seconds later, another light flashed from a different part of the property. Near the service entrance. A response. Daniel's eyes narrowed. This time, there was no innocent explanation that came easily to mind. For the first time that night, he felt certainty replacing suspicion. Something was coming. He did not know what. He did not know when. But every instinct he possessed told him the same thing. At 3:58 a.m., the surgical floor still looked normal. Patients slept behind closed doors. Machines monitored heartbeats and oxygen levels. The nurses' station remained softly illuminated beneath overhead lights. To anyone walking through the corridor, St. Gabriel Medical Center appeared exactly as it had every other night. But Daniel Hayes knew something was wrong. He could feel it. Not through instinct alone. Through observation. The pieces he had collected over the past several hours no longer felt disconnected. They felt organized. Deliberate. And organized threats were always the most dangerous. Daniel stood beside the medication room reviewing charts when the first sign appeared. Every computer screen at the nurses' station suddenly froze. Jessica frowned. What happened? A resident doctor tapped his keyboard. Nothing responded. Across the floor, another nurse called out. My system just crashed. Within seconds, every workstation displayed the same error message. Network connection lost. The staff exchanged confused looks. Technology failures happened. Hospitals dealt with them regularly. But Daniel's attention immediately shifted elsewhere. The timing felt wrong. Too precise. Too sudden. Then the lights flickered. Just once. The brief interruption lasted less than a second. Yet it changed everything. Daniel looked toward the elevators. The doors had stopped moving. The indicator lights above them were dark. A strange silence settled over the corridor. The kind of silence that appears moments before disaster. Jessica noticed it too. Why does this suddenly feel bad? Before Daniel could answer, a scream echoed from the far end of the floor. Everyone turned. A woman stood frozen near the visitor waiting area. Her eyes were locked on the elevator lobby. Several feet away, the elevator doors slowly slid open. 3 masked men stepped out. Each carried a rifle. For one long second, nobody moved. Nobody understood what they were seeing. The image felt impossible. Wrong. Like something from another world. Then reality arrived. One of the gunmen raised his weapon. Everyone stay where you are. Panic exploded instantly. A nurse screamed. A patient alarm began sounding from a nearby room. Doctors backed away in shock. Several visitors attempted to run. The lead gunman fired a single round into the ceiling. The deafening blast silenced the floor. Pieces of ceiling tile rained onto the corridor. Smoke drifted through the air. Nobody moved after that. Nobody. The message was clear. The gunmen were in control. Daniel remained exactly where he stood. His heart rate increased slightly. Nothing more. Around him, fear spread like fire. People cried. Some shook uncontrollably. Others appeared completely frozen. The gunman advanced with professional discipline. Not military, but organized, focused, dangerous. 3 more armed men emerged from a stairwell seconds later. Now there were 6. Daniel counted automatically. 6 attackers. Rifles. Body armor. Communication earpieces. Structured movement. Not amateurs. The leader stepped forward. He appeared to be in his 40s. Confident. Used to authority. His rifle never wavered. "Listen carefully," he said. His voice carried throughout the corridor. "If you cooperate, nobody gets hurt." Nobody believed him. Not after the gunshot. Not after the masks. Not after the rifles. The leader pointed toward several doctors. "You." He motioned with his weapon. "Move to the center station." The doctors obeyed immediately. Fear removed hesitation. One by one, nurses, surgeons, residents, and visitors were gathered into the central area of the surgical floor. The gunman controlled every entrance, every hallway, every exit. Within minutes, the entire floor had become a prison. Daniel stood among the hostages. Quiet, observant, invisible, exactly where he wanted to be. The leader paced slowly in front of the group. "We control this floor." His eyes moved across the crowd. "The elevators are locked. The stairwells are secured. Communications are disabled. Security has been dealt with." A terrified resident doctor spoke. "What do you want?" The leader smiled slightly. "Not you." The answer made Daniel pay attention. This operation was targeted. That changed things. Random violence created chaos. Targeted operations followed objectives. Objectives created opportunities. The leader continued. "We are waiting for someone." Nobody responded. Fear had stolen every voice. The gunman looked satisfied. "Until then, nobody leaves." One elderly patient suddenly began coughing violently nearby. The sound echoed through the tense silence. A nurse instinctively moved toward him. A rifle immediately pointed in her direction. She froze. The patient continued struggling. Daniel watched carefully. The gunmen were nervous. Disciplined but nervous. That mattered. Nervous men made mistakes. The leader finally nodded. "Help him." The nurse rushed forward. The crisis passed. But Daniel had learned something important. The attackers wanted control. Not immediate bloodshed. That distinction could save lives later. Minutes passed. Then more. The floor remained locked down. Hostages sat against walls. Doctors whispered prayers. Patients cried inside their rooms. The atmosphere became increasingly tense. Every passing minute deepened the fear. Jessica sat beside Daniel. Her hands trembled. "What is happening?" Daniel kept his voice low. "I don't know. You seem calmer than everyone else." He looked toward the armed men. "Panic doesn't solve problems." She stared at him. Somehow, his composure made her feel slightly safer. She couldn't explain why. Neither could anyone else. At 4:23 a.m., one of the gunmen approached the nurse's station. He began reviewing patient records. Searching. Looking for something specific. The realization immediately caught Daniel's attention. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't terrorism. It wasn't random violence. They were hunting for information. Or a person. The leader suddenly received a radio transmission. He listened carefully. Then nodded. A visible change appeared in his posture. Whatever he heard had mattered. Very much. The leader turned toward his men. Positions. Instantly, the attackers spread throughout the floor. Covering hallways. Watching entrances. Preparing. For what? Daniel didn't know yet. But he understood one thing clearly. The situation had just become more dangerous. Because whoever the gunmen were waiting for was getting closer. And when that person arrived, the fragile control holding the situation together might disappear completely. The leader looked over the... By 4:31 a.m., the surgical floor had fallen into an uneasy silence. The initial panic had burned itself out. Now only fear remained. Fear was quieter, heavier, more exhausting. The hostages sat where they had been ordered to sit. Some leaned against walls. Others held trembling hands over their faces. Several patients had been moved from their rooms into areas where the gunmen could monitor them more easily. The attackers maintained control of every corridor intersection, every exit, every approach. Their operation looked increasingly organized. Daniel continued observing. 6 gunmen. No visible insignia. Commercial-grade body armor. Military-style rifles. Professional communication procedures. But there were weaknesses. Always weaknesses. One man checked his phone too often. Another repeatedly adjusted his sling. A third constantly scanned for threats but ignored blind angles behind him. Daniel noticed everything. Not because he planned to fight them. Because information kept people alive. Especially in situations like this. Across the room, Jessica sat beside an elderly woman recovering from heart surgery. The woman was crying quietly. Jessica did her best to comfort her. Most of the medical staff had shifted into survival mode. Protect the patients. Avoid provoking the gunman. Wait for help. Daniel understood the logic. But waiting alone rarely solved crises. At 4:42 a.m., a sharp alarm suddenly shattered the silence. Every head turned. The sound came from room 723, one of the cardiac recovery rooms. A monitor emitted rapid warning tones, the kind medical professionals never ignored. Jessica reacted instantly. That patient is crashing. The nearest gunman stepped into her path. Stay where you are. The patient needs help. Sit down. The monitor says he's in distress. The gunman raised his rifle slightly. Jessica froze. Inside the room, alarms continued screaming. Daniel listened carefully. The rhythm told him something. It wasn't equipment failure. It wasn't accidental. A real medical emergency was developing. The patient could die. The hostages exchanged nervous looks. Doctors recognized the sounds as well. Several stood halfway before stopping themselves. Nobody wanted to provoke the armed men. The leader approached. Annoyance crossed his face. What is that noise? A surgeon answered. Cardiac instability. The leader frowned. Meaning? The surgeon swallowed. Meaning if nobody intervenes, he could die. The gunman looked irritated rather than concerned. To him, the patient represented a complication. Nothing more. The alarms continued. Louder. More urgent. Seconds mattered now. Daniel stood. Immediately, several rifles shifted toward him. The room tightened. The leader stared at him. Sit down. Daniel remained calm. The patient needs treatment. So does every patient in this building. This one may not survive another few minutes. The leader studied him. Unlike the others, Daniel's voice showed no panic. No pleading. Only certainty. The difference caught his attention. You his doctor? No. Then sit down. Daniel shook his head once. If he dies, the noise stops. The leader frowned. Daniel continued. But if a patient dies under your control, everyone here becomes harder to manage. Silence followed. The logic landed. Not emotional. Practical. The gunman glanced toward the room. Then back toward Daniel. You think you can help him? Yes. One of the other gunmen spoke. Could be a trick. Daniel met his gaze. A dying patient helps nobody. Another moment passed. The alarms continued their relentless warning. Finally, the leader pointed. You have 3 minutes. Daniel immediately moved. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just efficiently. Inside room 723, he approached the patient. A 60-year-old man named Frank Delaney. Recent bypass surgery. Rapid heartbeat. Declining oxygen saturation. The situation was serious. Jessica followed once permission was granted. Together they assessed the problem. Daniel's hands remained steady. His breathing remained calm. The patient struggled for air. Fear filled his eyes. Help me, he whispered. We're helping you now. Daniel adjusted oxygen flow. Reviewed medications. Checked surgical notes. Then he noticed something. A drainage line had become partially obstructed. A small issue. but dangerous enough to trigger complications. Working carefully, he corrected it. The monitors responded gradually. Heart rhythm improved. Oxygen levels climbed. The warning alarms slowed, then stopped. The room fell silent. Relief swept across everyone present, including the patient. Outside the doorway, several gunmen watched. The leader stood among them. His eyes never left Daniel. Not because of the medical treatment, because of the way he handled pressure. Most people became visibly stressed when rifles were nearby. Daniel had behaved as if none existed. That bothered him. When Daniel exited the room, the leader stopped him. "What's your name?" "Daniel." "Last name?" "Hayes." The gunman studied him. "Nurse Hayes." Daniel said nothing. "You don't seem scared." A dangerous question. Daniel answered carefully. "I am focused on my patients." The leader held his gaze for several seconds, searching, looking for something. Then he stepped aside. Daniel returned to the hostages. The conversation ended, but suspicion had begun. Jessica leaned closer. "How did you stay so calm?" Daniel looked toward the recovering patient. "Someone had to." She shook her head. "No." Her voice lowered. "That's not what I mean." Daniel didn't respond, because he understood exactly what she meant. Most people showed fear. He showed control. The difference was becoming noticeable. And noticeable was dangerous. At 5:01 a.m., another radio transmission reached the leader. Again, his expression changed. Again, tension increased among the attackers. Whatever operation they were conducting was approaching a critical stage. Daniel watched quietly. Information continued accumulating. The gunmen were waiting for something. Their patience was thinning. Their confidence was becoming strained. And strained people made mistakes. The leader suddenly issued new orders. 2 gunmen moved toward the stairwell. Another secured the elevator lobby. A 4th repositioned near the nurses' station. Defensive placements. Preparation for contact. Something was coming. Daniel could see it. The attackers could feel it. Even the hostages sensed the growing tension. The atmosphere on the surgical floor changed. Subtly, but unmistakably, like the air before a storm breaks. Then, as Daniel glanced toward a nearby corridor, at 5:07 a.m., the surgical floor remained under the control of the gunmen. But the situation was changing. Not visibly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Daniel Hayes sat among the hostages, watching. The attackers believed they were managing the crisis. In reality, they were revealing themselves. Every minute provided information. Every movement exposed a habit. Every order revealed part of their structure. Daniel focused on details. The leader. The second in command. The nervous rifleman near the elevators. The older man guarding the stairwell. 6 attackers. But only one made decisions. That mattered. Organizations often looked strong from the outside. Remove leadership and confusion spread quickly. Daniel had learned that lesson years ago. The service corridor that had briefly been left unguarded was now covered again. Still, the mistake told him something important. The attackers were becoming tired. Fatigue created openings. At the nurses' station, one gunman searched through hospital records again. Frustration appeared on his face. He wasn't finding what he wanted. That confirmed Daniel's earlier suspicion. They weren't here for money. They were searching for someone. Or something. The leader received another radio message. His reply was short. "Not yet." Daniel memorized the words. "Not yet." Meaning the operation remained incomplete. Meaning their objective had not arrived. Or had not been found. Across the room, Jessica noticed Daniel studying the attackers. "What are you looking at?" "Their patterns." She frowned. "Patterns." Daniel nodded slightly. "People repeat behaviors under stress." "You sound like a psychologist." "No." His eyes remained on the gunman. "Just observant." Jessica looked unconvinced. Before she could ask another question, A patient called for help from nearby. She moved immediately. Daniel watched her go. Even frightened, the staff continued caring for patients. That mattered. Fear had not broken them. Near 5:20 a.m., another problem emerged. A post-surgical patient required medication stored inside a locked supply room. The room sat beyond one of the gunmen's positions. A young resident doctor approached cautiously. "We need access." The gunman shook his head. "No movement. The patient requires treatment." "No." The resident looked helpless. Daniel stood. "Again." The gunman immediately noticed. "You again." "The medication is necessary." The attacker looked irritated. "You seem very interested in helping people." Daniel answered calmly. "I'm a nurse." Several hostages exchanged glances. The response sounded simple, yet somehow it carried unusual weight. The gunman eventually allowed supervised access. The problem was resolved. But the exchange created another observation. The attackers had begun recognizing Daniel. Recognition created risk. Invisible people survived crises more easily. Daniel was becoming visible. At 5:31 a.m., the leader approached him directly. The corridor grew quiet. Even the other hostages watched. "What hospital did you train at?" Daniel met his eyes. "Several. Military." The question arrived unexpectedly. Jessica looked surprised. So did the nearby doctors. Daniel's expression never changed. "No." The leader continued studying him. Something about Daniel bothered him. He couldn't explain why. The calm. The posture. The way his eyes constantly assessed the environment. Most civilians didn't behave that way. Yet he had no proof of anything. After several seconds, he walked away. Daniel remained seated. Inside, however, he understood the danger. Suspicion was growing. And suspicion eventually became investigation. At 5:39 a.m., a disturbance erupted near the west hallway. One of the patients attempted to leave his room. A frightened elderly man suffering from confusion after surgery. The gunman guarding the corridor reacted aggressively. "Get back inside." The patient didn't understand. Fear and confusion clouded his judgment. The rifleman stepped forward. Daniel moved before anyone else. He positioned himself between them. Not confrontational. Not threatening. Simply present. The patient is disoriented. The gunman glared at him. Daniel continued calmly. He doesn't understand what is happening. For a moment, tension filled the hallway. Then the elderly man began shaking visibly. The gunman lowered his weapon. Only slightly. But enough. Daniel guided the patient safely back into the room. No violence. No confrontation. Only restraint. Several staff members watched the scene. They noticed something. The gunman had listened to Daniel. Not because Daniel demanded it. Because he projected certainty. Quiet authority. The kind difficult to fake. When Daniel exited the room, Jessica spoke softly. "Who are you?" He looked at her. "A nurse." She almost laughed. But she didn't. Because for the first time, she was beginning to suspect there was more to the answer. At 5:48 a.m., another radio transmission reached the leader. This one changed everything. The man stiffened immediately. His expression hardened. Then he spoke 3 words. "He's in position." Every attacker became alert. Weapons tightened. Attention sharpened. The objective had arrived. Or the target had been found. Whatever the case, the waiting phase was over. The operation was entering its next stage. Daniel recognized the shift instantly. The gunmen were no longer preparing. They were moving. And movement created danger. As the leader started issuing fresh orders, Daniel understood something else. The real crisis had not begun when the attackers locked down the surgical floor. That had only been the opening move. The true confrontation was still ahead. And when it arrived, everyone trapped inside St. Gabriel Medical Center would be forced to make choices they could never take back. At 5:56 a.m., the atmosphere on the surgical floor changed completely. The attackers were no longer waiting. They were acting. The leader gathered 2 of his men near the nurses' station, while another moved toward the intensive recovery rooms. Whatever objective had brought them into the hospital was now close. Daniel watched carefully. Then he noticed the mistake. A young trauma surgeon named Dr. Michael Grant noticed it too. One of the gunmen had briefly exposed his position near a service door. The opening lasted only seconds. For frightened civilians, it meant nothing. For desperate people, it looked like a chance. Dr. Grant made a decision. The wrong one. Without warning, he lunged. The surgeon slammed into the gunman and tried to grab the rifle. For a brief moment, chaos exploded. Shouting, struggling, panic. Then a gunshot echoed through the corridor. The sound froze everyone. The surgeon collapsed. Not dead, but badly wounded. A round had torn through his shoulder. Patients screamed. Several nurses rushed forward instinctively. The attackers immediately regained control. Weapons covered the hostages. The leader looked furious. Nobody moves again. Silence followed. Terrified silence. Blood spread across the floor beside Dr. Grant. Daniel immediately assessed the injury. The surgeon would survive, but only if treated quickly. The problem was obvious. The gunman no longer trusted anyone. The leader stared at the wounded surgeon. Then at Daniel. "You said you're a nurse." "I am." "Save him." Daniel moved without hesitation. Jessica joined him. Together they stopped the bleeding and stabilized the surgeon. Throughout the treatment, Daniel ignored the rifles aimed in his direction. His focus never shifted. The leader noticed. Again, most people looked at weapons. Daniel looked at problems. The difference bothered him more each time. As treatment continued, Daniel quietly examined the corridor. The struggle had revealed something useful. A service access panel had been damaged during the fight. Inside ran emergency communication lines. A possible opportunity. Small, risky, but real. Once the surgeon was stabilized, Daniel stepped back. The leader approached. His voice lowered. "You've seen violence before." It wasn't a question. Daniel met his gaze. "I work in a hospital." The gunman studied him. He didn't believe the answer, but he couldn't prove otherwise. For now. Meanwhile, Dr. Grant was alive. The cost of his mistake was visible to everyone. Fear deepened across the floor. Yet another change had occurred. The hostages had witnessed Daniel under extreme pressure. No panic. No hesitation. No confusion. Only action. And slowly, people were beginning to realize that the quiet ward nurse understood crises far better than he should. The night was becoming more dangerous. But Daniel now possessed something valuable. Information. And information was the first step toward survival. By 6:14 a.m., exhaustion had begun affecting everyone on the surgical floor. The hostages were physically and emotionally drained. Patients needed medications, monitoring, and reassurance. Doctors struggled to maintain focus. Even the gunman looked increasingly tense. Pressure was building from every direction. Daniel used that pressure to observe. The damaged access panel from the earlier struggle had revealed a narrow maintenance passage connecting 2 sections of the floor. It wasn't a true escape route, but it led to an emergency communications junction. For the first time since the lockdown began, Daniel saw a realistic chance to contact the outside world. The problem was simple. Only one person could reach it safely. And if he tried, he might not return. At 6:22 a.m., Daniel quietly slipped into a supply room while delivering medication. Inside, he examined the maintenance access more carefully. The opening was small but usable. Beyond it ran a narrow service space hidden behind the walls. From there, he could potentially reach the communication junction. His heart remained calm. His mind began calculating risks. Then he heard a voice. "Jessica." She had followed him. "What are you doing?" Daniel closed the panel. "Checking supplies." She didn't believe him. "Not anymore." "Daniel." He looked at her. "Something is different about you." Neither spoke for a moment. Then she said something unexpected. "If you're planning something, be careful." Daniel held her gaze. For the first time all night, he saw understanding rather than curiosity. She didn't know who he was, but she trusted him. That trust carried weight. A few minutes later, Daniel returned to the hostages. The opportunity remained. So did the risk. Then the situation changed again. One of the recovering patients began deteriorating. A teenage accident victim. Internal complications. Immediate treatment was required. The medical staff rushed to help. Daniel joined them. As he worked, he understood something clearly. If he attempted the communication route now, these patients would lose one of the few people capable of helping during a crisis. The realization created a difficult choice. Leave. Possibly reach authorities. Possibly end the standoff faster. Or remain. Protect the people directly in front of him. Years earlier, Daniel had faced similar decisions. Different locations. Different circumstances. The same question. Mission or responsibility? He already knew his answer. At 6:37 a.m., he abandoned the escape opportunity. The access panel remained untouched. The communication route remained unused. Daniel stayed with the patients. Not because it was safer. Because it was right. The decision carried a cost. Outside help would arrive later than it might have otherwise. The danger would continue longer. But nobody under his care would be abandoned. Across the floor, the leader received another radio update. Whatever objective the attackers were pursuing was reaching its conclusion. Their behavior became increasingly urgent. Orders came faster. Positions changed more frequently. The operation was entering its final phase. Daniel recognized the signs. The end was approaching. One way or another. As morning light slowly began appearing beyond the hospital windows, the surgical floor stood balanced between survival and catastrophe. And Daniel Hayes had made his choice. He would stay with the people who depended on him, no matter what happened next. By 6:51 a.m., the first light of dawn was visible beyond the hospital windows. Inside the surgical floor, however, the night felt far from over. The attackers had grown increasingly restless. Their radios were active. Their movements were sharper. Something had gone wrong with their plan. Daniel could see it. The confidence they carried earlier was fading. The leader spent several minutes arguing quietly over his radio. The conversation ended with visible frustration. For the first time since the lockdown began, uncertainty appeared among the gunmen. And uncertainty created opportunity. Not for violence. For coordination. Throughout the night, the hospital staff had watched Daniel solve problems, calm patients, and make decisions under pressure. Now they instinctively looked toward him. Not because he demanded authority. Because he quietly earned it. Daniel never gave orders. Instead, he spoke in simple instructions. A nurse was asked to monitor specific patients. A surgeon was positioned near critical recovery rooms. Jessica was assigned to coordinate medications. Each task sounded routine. Medical. Ordinary. The gunman barely noticed. But together, those small actions organized the staff into an effective support network. If chaos erupted, patients would not be abandoned. That was Daniel's priority. At 7:03 a.m., the situation suddenly escalated. A radio message reached the attackers. Several exchanged alarmed looks. The leader immediately moved toward the elevators. Positions. Now. The command echoed across the floor. Weapons came up. Hostages froze. Something was happening outside. Daniel looked toward the windows. Emergency vehicles had begun arriving below. Not dozens. Not an assault force. Just enough to tell him authorities finally understood the seriousness of the situation. The attackers understood it too. Pressure mounted instantly. One nervous gunman grabbed a frightened resident doctor and pulled him forward. A human shield. Fear was taking control. Dangerous fear. The kind that caused mistakes. Daniel stepped forward carefully. The leader immediately noticed. Stay where you are. The doctor isn't a threat. Neither are you. Daniel remained calm. The resident doctor was trembling. One wrong move could trigger disaster. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Then Daniel spoke again. Quietly. Steadily. "You're losing control." The words landed. Not as an insult. As an observation. The gunman holding the doctor hesitated. The leader saw it. So did everyone else. A tiny crack had appeared inside the attacker's discipline. The leader ordered the doctor released. Reluctantly, the gunman obeyed. The crisis passed. But the balance had shifted. The attackers were no longer controlling events. They were reacting to them. At 7:11 a.m., another radio transmission arrived. This time the leader's face changed completely. Shock. Then anger. Then realization. Whatever objective had brought them into the hospital had failed. The operation was collapsing. Daniel understood immediately. Desperate people become unpredictable. The most dangerous phase had arrived. Around him, doctors and nurses quietly prepared patients for possible evacuation. No panic. No dramatic speeches. Just professionals doing their jobs under impossible circumstances. And at the center of it all stood Daniel Hayes. Still wearing hospital scrubs. Still appearing to be nothing more than a ward nurse. Yet somehow holding the floor together through the worst night of their lives. Outside, authorities were moving into position. Inside, the attackers were beginning to unravel. The final confrontation was now only minutes away. At 7:19 a.m., the surgical floor stood on the edge of collapse. The attackers knew their operation had failed. The hostages knew something was changing. And outside the hospital, authorities were preparing to end the standoff. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The tension felt almost physical. Then a voice came through the hospital loudspeaker system. Calm. Professional. Controlled. Attention. This building is surrounded. Remain where you are. Further instructions will follow. Several gunmen immediately turned toward the windows. Others checked their radios. The leader remained silent. His face had become unreadable. Daniel watched carefully. Desperate leaders were dangerous. But this one seemed to understand the reality of the situation. The hospital was no longer isolated. Time had run out. Minutes later, movement appeared outside the surgical floor entrance. Not rushing. Not chaotic. Disciplined. A tactical team had entered the building. Their progress was methodical. Professional. The attackers saw it coming. So did Daniel. The leader lowered his weapon slightly. For the first time all night, uncertainty outweighed confidence. Then something unexpected happened. A voice echoed from the hallway beyond the secured entrance. A single name. Hayes. The word carried through the corridor. Several hostages looked toward Daniel. The attackers did too. The voice came again. Stronger this time. Daniel Hayes. Silence followed. The leader slowly turned toward him. Jessica stared. The surgeons stared. Everyone stared. Daniel remained calm. A tactical commander stepped into view beyond the doorway. His eyes immediately found Daniel. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then the commander nodded once. A gesture of recognition. Respect. History. The surgical floor noticed it instantly. The commander addressed the attackers. "You are finished." No shouting. No threats. Just certainty. Then his gaze returned briefly to Daniel. And everything changed. The leader noticed it. The staff noticed it. The meaning was impossible to miss. The commander knew the quiet ward nurse. Not as a nurse. As something else. One of the surgeons whispered, "Who is he?" Nobody answered. The commander finally spoke again. This time to Daniel. "Good to see you standing, Sergeant." The word hit the room like another gunshot. "Sergeant." Jessica looked stunned. Several doctors exchanged confused glances. The attackers looked at Daniel differently now. Pieces suddenly connected. The calm. The discipline. The decisions. The pressure. The leader almost laughed. All night. His voice carried disbelief. All night, You were sitting here. Daniel didn't respond. He never needed to. The commander continued. We'll take it from here. The message was clear. The tactical team advanced. The remaining gunmen saw the situation for what it was. Finished. One by one, weapons lowered. The standoff ended not with violence, but with surrender. And as officers moved in to secure the floor, the staff remained focused on one thing. Daniel, the nurse they thought they knew. The man who had quietly protected them through the longest night of their lives. Yet even now, he said almost nothing. Because the reveal had never come from him. It came from those who already knew exactly who he was. By 8:02 a.m., the crisis was over. The surgical floor no longer echoed with commands and fear. Instead, it sounded like a hospital again. Monitors beeped. Stretchers moved through corridors. Doctors reviewed patients. Nurses completed reports. Life slowly returned to normal. Yet nobody who had lived through the night felt normal. The memory would remain with them for a long time. Several investigators arrived to document the incident. Hospital administrators moved from room to room gathering information. Tactical officers secured evidence and escorted the attackers from the building. Through it all, Daniel Hayes remained focused on patients. Exactly where he had been before the lockdown. Exactly where he wanted to be. In room 723, Frank Delaney, the cardiac patient whose life Daniel had helped save, looked up as he entered. They told me what happened. Daniel checked the monitor. People talk. The patient smiled. You saved a lot of us. Daniel adjusted an 4-line. The staff saved each other. Frank shook his head. Maybe. But his expression suggested otherwise. Across the floor, Jessica completed paperwork before finally finding Daniel near the medication station. For several seconds she simply stood there, trying to reconcile two different versions of the same person. The quiet nurse, and the man the tactical commander had called Sergeant. You could have told us. Daniel looked up. It wasn't relevant. Jessica almost laughed. After last night, I think it was. Daniel closed the chart in his hands. What matters is that everyone is safe. The answer sounded exactly like him. Simple, direct, frustrating, yet somehow reassuring. A few minutes later, the tactical commander appeared one final time. Several staff members immediately recognized him. The corridor grew quiet. The commander approached Daniel. You disappearing again? Daniel nodded slightly. Probably. The commander smiled. Some things never change. He extended a hand. Daniel shook it. Nothing dramatic. Nothing ceremonial. Just mutual respect between two men who shared a past. As the commander walked away, curiosity followed him. Questions followed him. But answers did not. Daniel never offered them. Near the end of the morning, hospital leadership gathered staff for a brief update. Gratitude was expressed. Courage was acknowledged. Lives had been saved. The crisis had ended. Several people expected Daniel to be singled out, recognized, celebrated. It never happened. Partly because he requested it. Partly because he quietly stepped away before anyone could organize it. That decision surprised nobody who truly understood him. By 9:15 a.m., sunlight filled the windows overlooking the city. The hospital was busy again. New patients arrived. New surgeries were scheduled. New emergencies demanded attention. Life moved forward. Daniel stood alone for a moment at the same window where he had first noticed the suspicious truck hours earlier. The parking lot below looked ordinary now. Police vehicles were leaving. Reporters remained behind barriers. The danger was gone. Jessica approached quietly. You really were special forces? Daniel considered the question. Then he answered in the simplest way possible. That was a long time ago. She nodded. Somehow she understood. The title mattered less than the choices. The training mattered less than the actions. What everyone would remember wasn't what Daniel had been. It was what he had done. When fear took control of everyone else, he remained calm. When patients needed help, he stepped forward. When escape was possible, he stayed. Not because anyone ordered him to. Because responsibility demanded it. A call light suddenly illuminated down the hallway. Another patient needed assistance. Daniel glanced toward it. Then back toward Jessica. Duty calls. She smiled. For a nurse. Daniel returned the smile. Just slightly. For a nurse. Moments later, he walked down the corridor and disappeared into another patient room. No audience followed him. No applause waited for him. No spotlight found him. The doctors returned to work. The nurses returned to work. And Daniel Hayes returned to work. The same quiet ward nurse everyone thought they knew. Only now, they understood something they hadn't understood before. Strength did not always announce itself. Sometimes it wore ordinary scrubs. Sometimes it spoke softly. And sometimes the strongest person in the room was the one nobody noticed until the crisis began. The surgical floor would remember that lesson for years. Daniel never spoke about the night again. He never corrected the rumors. He never explained his past. He simply continued caring for patients. One room at a time. One shift at a time. Exactly as he always had. And in the end, that was how he preferred it. Not as a hero. Not as a legend. Just a nurse doing his job. The end.